Seneca, Letters from a Stoic. Who the hell was he? What's the book about? Why is he famous? What is he famous for? Why are his 2,000-year-old philosophical lessons still important to life today? I'm going to answer all of these and many more in this video. Let's go. So Seneca was born around 4 BC. Some people think he was born as late as 1 BC. Who really cares? He was born in Cordoba, Hispania, nowadays known as Cordoba, Spain, and born into a very wealthy family. His father, also named Seneca, was a famous rhetorician, which really means he talked a lot of shit. Now, what it really means is he was good with words, kind of like a lawyer. This meant that young Seneca got a great education. His father's wealth and status gave him access to private tutors who'd teach him all kinds of things: philosophy, literature, public speaking, to name a few. Now, just like all the other trust fund babies in the world, despite his wealth, his childhood wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. It turns out he was actually quite the asthmatic, and the illness got so bad at times that he even contemplated committing suicide. The only thing stopping him being the thought of his father's inability to bear the loss. Remember, suicide doesn't take away your pain, it transfers it to those who love you. In an effort to help with his asthma, he spent some time overseas trying to get away from the home conditions that were causing him problems. More specifically, he spent some time in Egypt with an aunt, and this is where he gets his first taste of true worldly knowledge. See, his aunt's husband was actually the viceroy to the Roman emperor. Now I had to Google what viceroy meant, and it's essentially someone who sits in place of the king when the king's not there. So his uncle was the representative of the Roman Empire with regards to all dealings in Egypt. A big position. And so Seneca, being in close proximity to his family, gets to dip his toes into real-world politics for the first time. But anyway, his education isn't complete just yet. His father, like any typical rich father, had his own plans for his son, and wanted him to become a prominent public figure in Roman politics. And so he sent the boy off to school in Rome to study rhetoric. Now, I've got absolutely no idea what studying rhetoric looks like, but it apparently involved the reciting of famous speeches, composing arguments on historical or mythological themes, and having debates with other students. Seneca obviously does pretty well in school, considering we're still reading his books and talking about them 2,000 years later. But his education in rhetoric wasn't his only focus while in Rome. The philosophical schools circulating at the time also got his attention, these being the Stoics, the Pythagoreans, and the Cynics. And he even admits that this was the stuff that really gripped him. The ideas on ethics, virtue, self-control, and overall, how to live life. All in all, the boy's been set up for a very, very prosperous future. So, we're going to skip a few years and jump straight into when Seneca was a rising star in the Roman Senate at around 40 years of age. He had a reputation for being concise and cutting in his arguments, a style that really contrasted all the other wanker senators who tried to make themselves sound more intelligent than they really were by using big, unnecessary words. However, it's important to note, when surfing the political waves of Rome, one must also realize that notoriety is a double-edged sword. Caligula, the emperor at the time, who was quite notorious for his volatility, soon became wary of Seneca's growing reputation. And this is where life in Rome starts to appear a little rocky for Seneca. Caligula, becoming quite jealous of Seneca, supposedly toyed with the idea of ordering his execution, only abandoning the plan when convinced that his fragile health would bring about his demise soon enough. Now, luckily for Seneca, Emperor Caligula actually got assassinated in about 41 AD. Not so lucky for Seneca was who succeeded him, being Emperor Claudius, Caligula's uncle. And this is where it gets a bit funny. Emperor Claudius almost immediately exiled Seneca to the island of Corsica. Why was Seneca exiled, you ask? Because he allegedly had an affair with Emperor Caligula's sister, Julia Livia. This guy was having an affair with the most powerful man in the world's sister. All that wisdom, and still, man struggles not to think with his penis. So, Claudius banishes Seneca to the island of Corsica, which, not gonna lie, looks like the perfect place to be exiled to. Nonetheless, the exile came as a shock. By now, Seneca was used to the political and intellectual life of Rome, and Corsica, even though it looks like paradise, was pretty remote and disconnected from the world. In total, his exile lasted approximately 8 years, and during these years, he really hunkered down on refining his Stoic principles. In a way, he was kind of forced to do so, because during these 8 years, not only did his father pass away, but so did his wife, and so did his son. Poor Seni. So, as the title suggests, he manages to get himself back to Rome. And this was around 49 AD. But how? Well, it actually came through the grace of a fairly important figure in Roman history, Agrippina the Younger, who was the new wife to the emperor and who convinced Claudius that Seneca's intellectual prowess could be perfectly harnessed to mentor their son, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, which is a completely ridiculous mouthful of a name, hence him soon to be renamed Nero. According to Tacitus, who was a historian and politician of the time, her motives were a belief that his literary fame would gain them popularity and his wisdom would make him a useful advisor to herself and Nero in their future plans for power. Every time I read up on Nero and his mother, they really remind me of Cersei and Joffrey from Game of Thrones. Anywho, let's dive into the years with Nero. This little prick ascended to the throne in 54 AD at just 17 years of age. Quite literally king of the world at 17. Weirdly enough though, for around 5 years, everything was actually going pretty great. He listened to people like Seneca, his mother, and this other guy Burrus. Burrus was the Praetorian Prefect, which is basically Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, if you've ever watched Game of Thrones. If you haven't, then you're stupid. Anyway, overall it was an administration that began on solid footing. But if you know anything about Nero, you know that it very quickly all went to shit. And here's how it all started. Like many of us do, when growing up, we reach a point where we might begin to resent our parents a bit. Personally, I think in a lot of cases, it's a projection of the inner anger and frustration we feel towards ourselves, but want to attribute to someone else so that we can maintain a less flawed self-image. But anyways, Nero grew up pretty resentful of his mother. So much so that the fat little brat actually tried to have her killed in an accidental maritime incident. That actually failed. And so when she got home, he just ordered his guards to execute her. As you can imagine, in the aftermath, the atmosphere of Rome had changed drastically. Nero now felt free to indulge his every whim and passion, and as a young man with quite literally unlimited power, I'm sure you know how that story goes. Anyway, how's Seneca doing in all this? Well, he obviously sensed the changing in the tides, and felt his influence over the volatile emperor fade into oblivion. And so his plan was to try and depart from public life on amicable terms with Nero, hoping to avoid the same fate as the boy's mother. His idea was, I'll offer up all my wealth to the emperor and suggest I go retire to live a quiet life elsewhere. Supposedly a win-win for both parties. Nero would never feel threatened by his wise and very, very wealthy advisor, and Seneca could retire peacefully and pursue his philosophical interests. And it actually worked. Until 65 AD, that is. And this was because of what's known as the Personnian Conspiracy, which was a plot by senators, knights, and members of the Praetorian Guard to assassinate the idiot emperor. This failed, tragically. When Seneca was questioned over his involvement in the conspiracy, he denied it and claimed to be focused on his philosophical pursuits, as previously discussed. There's actually no real evidence for the contrary. Nonetheless, Seneca, along with the others, were all ordered to commit suicide. Poor Seni. Okay, so now you've gotten a very brief biography of Seneca the Younger. Pretty cool dude. Now we can finally dive into his letters to Lucilius. These letters were actually written during those final years between 62 to 65 AD, where he retired from his political life and spent his remaining years focused on philosophy and simple living. The collection of 124 letters that comprise letters from a Stoic are all the letters Seneca sent to his friend Lucilius. Looking at the letters through today's lens, these letters were Seneca's magnum opus. They were written after decades in politics and studying philosophy, and were his attempt at continuing to deepen his philosophical understanding, mentor Lucilius, and leave a lasting legacy for all humanity. What I love most about these letters, though, is that because they're intimate letters to a good friend, the tone of the book is conversational and extremely approachable. And because we never actually get to read Lucilius's responses, we only read Seneca's letters, the entire reading experience is kind of like you're being mentored by an old wise uncle. So, what did he actually write in these letters? I obviously can't detail absolutely everything, so I'll first provide a brief overview of the main lessons Seneca offers, and then I'll delve into my favorite lessons and quotes. So overall, at their core, these letters are about how to live a good life. He blends philosophical ideas with practical advice and personal anecdotes to provide the audience with a complete picture of how Stoicism can very effectively change someone's life for the better. He covers ideas such as the nature of happiness, which he states comes from inner virtue and has nothing to do with external pleasures. He touches on control and acceptance, and continually emphasizes focusing on what's within your control and accepting anything that isn't. He reiterates the shortness of life and urges his readers to use their time wisely, focusing on meaningful pursuits rather than short-term pleasures or distractions. Meditating on and facing death is also something he talks about multiple times, arguing that contemplating your own mortality will free you from fear and help you live more fully. And finally, friendship and community. He continually reflects on the value of friendship and shared wisdom. For him, a good friend is a moral mirror, someone who helps you see your faults and become better. Now, let's finally dive into some of my favorite quotes and lessons of his that have been scattered throughout the letters. So I'll start off with a quote that I really love because it kind of reflects my own view for starting this channel in the first place.
Part of my joy in learning is that it puts me in a position to teach. Nothing, however outstanding and however helpful, will ever give me any pleasure if the knowledge is to be for my benefit alone. If wisdom were offered me on the one condition that I should keep it shut away and not divulge it to anyone, I should reject it. There is no enjoying the possession of anything valuable unless one has someone to share it with.
Amen to that, Senny. Here's a quote on friendship where he explicitly talks about how trusting and open you should be with friends.
You have sent me a letter by the hand of a friend of yours, as you call him, and in the next sentence you warn me to avoid discussing your affairs freely with him, since you are not even in the habit of doing so yourself. In other words, you have described him as being a friend, and then denied this in one and the same letter. Now, if you were using that word in a kind of popular sense, and not according to its strict meaning, and calling him a friend in much the same way as we refer to candidates as gentlemen, or hail someone with the greeting, my dear fellow, if when we meet him his name slips our memory, we can let this pass. But if you are looking on anyone as a friend when you do not trust him as you trust yourself, you are making a grave mistake, and have failed to grasp sufficiently the full force of true friendship.
And then just a little continuation of this.
Certainly you should discuss everything with a friend, but before you do so, discuss in your mind the man himself. After friendship is formed, you must trust, but before that you must judge.
This next quote is admittedly quite long, but what I like about it is it's basically a short summary on what Seneca thinks of philosophy as a whole and how we should be living our lives.
I view with pleasure and approval the way you keep on at your studies and sacrifice everything to your single-minded efforts to make yourself every day a better man. I do not merely urge you to persevere in this, I actually implore you to. Let me give you, though, this one piece of advice. Refrain from following the example of those whose craving is for attention, not their own improvement, by doing certain things which are calculated to give rise to comment on your appearance or way of living generally. Avoid shabby attire, long hair, an unkempt beard, an outspoken dislike of silverware, sleeping on the ground, and all other misguided means to self-advertisement. The very name of philosophy, however modest the manner in which it is pursued, is unpopular enough as it is. Imagine what the reaction would be if we started dissociating ourselves from the conventions of society. Inwardly, everything should be different, but our outward face should conform with the crowd. Our clothes should not be gaudy, yet they should not be dowdy either. We should not keep silver plate with inlays of solid gold, but at the same time we should not imagine that doing without gold and silver is proof that we are leading the simple life. Let our aim be a way of life not diametrically opposed to, but better than that of the mob. Otherwise we shall repel and alienate the very people whose reform we desire. We shall make them, moreover, reluctant to imitate us in anything for fear they may have to imitate us in everything. The first thing philosophy promises us is the feeling of fellowship, of belonging to mankind and being members of a community. Being different will mean the abandoning of that manifesto. We must watch that the means by which we hope to gain admiration do not earn ridicule and hostility. Our motto, as everyone knows, is to live in conformity with nature. It is quite contrary to nature to torture one's body, to reject simple standards of cleanliness and make a point of being dirty, to adopt a diet that is not just plain, but hideous and revolting. In the same way as a craving for dainties is a token of extravagant living, avoidance of familiar and inexpensive dishes betokens insanity. Philosophy calls for simple living, not for doing penance, and the simple way of life need not be a crude one. The standard which I accept is this: one's life should be a compromise between the ideal and the popular morality. People should admire our way of life, but they should at the same time find it understandable.
And then finally, this piece of advice is also one of my favorites for its mere practicality. He tells you explicitly what to do, and if followed, which I myself have tried, honestly seems to really provide a newer perspective.
Set aside now and then a number of days during which you will be content with the plainest of food and very little of it, and with rough, coarse clothing, and will ask yourself, is this what one used to dread? It is in times of security that the spirit should be preparing itself to deal with difficult times. While fortune is bestowing favors on it, then is the time for it to be strengthened against her rebuffs.
And this theme of rehearsing those things we're scared of is something he touches on multiple times, not exclusively with bad food or rough clothing, but also death.
Rehearse death. To say this is to tell a man to rehearse his freedom. A man who has learned how to die has unlearned how to be a slave. He is above, or, at any rate, beyond the reach of all political powers.
That's all for now, folks. I don't want to spoil the entirety of his letters for you. As much as I hope this video was beneficial, it's much more my hope that you pick up the book for yourself and have a read. If you wanted to grab yourself a copy, please consider using the affiliate link in the description. Let me know in the comments below if you have any feedback on the video or if there's any specific books you'd like me to make a video about. Thanks for watching.